Hey, what up, young scholars? It's your boy, the extra large professor from DadCypher, and I have a special guest, Dr. Abdill, who is the author of one of my favorite books on fatherhood, and that's Fathering in the Margins. So I just want to say, give it up for Dr. Abdill. She is an excellent writer. Her book covered Bed-Stuy community. So are you a Brooklyn native?
Yes, yes, I am. So I was born and raised in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. And so I was super excited to have my research be based there.
Why did you use hip hop lyricism to talk about the subject of Black fatherhood?
Um, the reason why I actually used a lot of hip hop lyrics in the book was because the field led me to. So I'm a sociologist by training, and my method for this book is an ethnographer. And so as an ethnographer, you go into your field, like what you are planning on studying, and you go into it with very limited preconceived questions and answers. You go to your field and you let your experience in the field kind of generate the knowledge that you're trying to understand and document. So, when I was a graduate student, my field was Bed-Stuy. I was a mom of two young kids at the time, and I was consistently taking my kids to the park. And I just started noticing there's a lot of fathers out here, fathers with their children. And I think at that time I was just starting to kind of think about comparing that to that, that long-standing stereotypes that fathers don't exist, particularly in Black communities, particularly in communities that have been underinvested in. And so as I began to talk to some of these men and understand how they made sense of fathering, a lot of the times what they would talk about was they would talk about rappers that they admired. They would talk about hip hop lyrics. And so I'm not a hip hop head. I love hip hop as much as I love R&B and Afro beats. But the reason why I spent so much time in the book kind of dissecting and understanding these lyrics was because the fathers themselves was using this as a way to make meaning of what it meant for them to be a father among all of the other identities that they held.
Wow, so using fatherhood to construct meaning, that's super dope. And what do you think has led to that quote unquote shift or change? Because you described you were sitting in that park and then you start noticing the dads and they're talking about hip hop. What do you think it is about the hip hop culture that have made dads, or do you think hip hop has had any impact on the way that dads have become more involved with their children?
Absolutely. And I think that as hip hop has changed and grown and expanded, so have our notions of Black masculinity, which has a lot to do with fatherhood, have kind of changed and expanded. So for instance, like I talk about in the book, and because this is the generation that I'm in. I'm part of Generation X and Millennial. I start from 1990s hip hop lyrics and kind of show how that a lot of the masculine gangster rap styles was shortly in time. There were other styles that were coming across where men was more allowed to kind of explore, experience, masculinity outside of the rough against it all.
Right.
It's me against the world kind of thing. And as more men became, there was more diversity in the type of Black male rappers and what they had lyrics about. I think fatherhood started coming up. So for me, being from Bed-Stuy, that significant, well-known quote from Biggie when he opened up his album, these cops are, basically paraphrasing, these cops are calling, people are calling the cops on me and I'm just here trying to feed my daughter. It opened up a way of understanding what fatherhood looks like for Black men who are dealing with the economic inequalities in the neighborhood that they're living in. And so hip hop definitely was a great way to kind of hear those different experiences and voices. They were kind of like anecdotes. And the way that I used it in my study was those were additional voices that I could use to kind of make some sort of understanding of what fatherhood has become and how men understand what it means to be a father, what it means to be a provider, what it means to be all of that, and how to use hip hop to kind of not only understand it, but to cope with it, to say, oh, so-and-so, T.I. came up a lot, I think, because he was on reality TV at the time. Like he's a great rapper. He has all of these things I admire about him, but he's also a good father. And I could see him fathering because I'm seeing it on reality TV and I'm hearing it in his lyrics. Jay-Z was another one. There's so many rappers that when the men in my study were trying to explain to me about fatherhood, they would say, oh, like so and so said.
Wow, man, that is amazing, because you know what? Typically, when we talk about when other scholars outside of the culture talk about hip hop, they always talk about the negativity, the misogyny, and all these different things. But you're really talking about how this becomes a point of reference. This becomes a sort of marker or a blueprint of what it's like or what it can be to be a father, and how do they cope with that. So many questions that I have about that. The first one, I guess, how do you think that hip hop has bucked the stereotype of the absentee father?
Well, I mean, this is definitely something that I really kind of worked through in my book, and I concluded about the number one way that I think academics were getting it wrong up until that point was this dichotomy where you either had to be like the perfect father or not a father at all. And those were the only things that existed in the Black community. And so, for you to be the perfect father, it was pretty much, you had to be, like Heathcliff Huxtable. You had to be,
Exactly.
extremely educated, a provider. You had to be first and foremost, a husband. You had to live with your kids, right? And if you didn't check all of these boxes, then it automatically meant that you weren't a good dad. But there were, and many of us, growing up in Black communities, there is a large middle ground there where there are men who are being really good fathers, but they may not be living with their child. Maybe things didn't work out with that child's mother, but they're still trying to be engaged. Maybe they cannot provide solely. They can't be the sole provider, but they are providing in other ways, like taking care of their children,
Right.
and using the resources they do have to support their child. So they may not be living at home, but they're visiting every day. And for a lot of the men in my study, they were consistently taking their children to and from childcare. So these are so many other ways that men were being fathers, but not getting acknowledgement of that. And even to the point where academics have kind of really set this idea of like fatherless fathers, like, I mean, fatherless children. Yes, there were some children where the fathers were completely absent, where the children didn't know who their fathers were. But compared to that large gray area where children did know where their fathers were, they did have some relationship with them, just maybe not consistently because of a whole host of reasons, which I kind of work out and list in my book. What this book did was help kind of dismantle that notion that unless you're this perfect father, then you're not a father at all.
Yeah, that is so powerful, because you know what? We haven't seen those type of images. Normally, like you said, it was either the Heathcliff Huxtable, and then even in today's time, you'll see Blackish that's really like upper or middle class, And the last time we saw like a dad that was maybe lower income that was a good father may have been like Good Times or maybe a show like Rock, which you talk
Mm-hmm.
about in your
Mm-hmm.
text and that sort of thing. One of the things that you really talked about in your text is like the different challenges that these dads face, like whether it be maternal gatekeeping, whether
Mm-hmm.
it be gatekeeping by the grandmothers, whether it be gainful employment. What type of, how do you see hip hop as a way of helping these dads to cope with challenges that maybe other dads in other communities may not face?
Yeah, I mean this is great like saying in one of Tupac's songs where he's talking about like, I used to listen to Marvin Gaye and Marvin Gaye had me feeling like black was the thing to
Thing to
be.
be,
Right.
yeah.
And it's just something about like that black music, right? That's like, oh, somebody's feeling what I'm feeling. Somebody's going through what I'm going through. And hip hop for a lot of Generation X, millennials, like that was the thing. Like Black men trying to navigate all the inequalities in their context, and sometimes not necessarily feeling understood and wanting to feel understood, and going to music to do that, to feel understood.
Take it out of the world of the academia and let's just look at childcare and look at just the daily ways that Black dads are looked at. One of the things that stuck out in your book was the fact that teachers at the child care center failed to recognize, even when you were saying, I'm pointing them out to you, here are the dads, they're coming in, and that sort of thing. But they were like Ralph Ellison was saying, they were invisible because people refused to see them. So I want to talk about like, what is it about Black males that render them invisible in these settings with teachers, in particular with Black female teachers that you talk about in the text?
Yeah, I mean, it's, at the heart of it, right? It's stereotypes and it's racism and it's internalized racism. So you have this narrative that has been drilled into the Black community for decades about, like Black fathers being completely absent, Black fathers being, being the cause of so much plight that's happening in Black families. And saying that without talking about any of the context of why Black men struggle as family men in their families, and without acknowledging the ways that Black men have struggled to hold those positions even in spite of it. And so focusing on the extreme, focusing on the negative cases and not focusing on the positive cases, or not placing Black men within the context of seeing them trying to do better, but then seeing all of the obstacles and barriers that they have to fight in order to do that. And so, the juxtaposition of showing the teachers the data about, okay, Black men are here, they're showing up and still not seeing it. That was a surprise in my book. Remember when I told you earlier, I didn't go in, with this particular question. It just came up when, like when I started to notice not just the teachers themselves, but community members when you ask them about, are there fathers in this community? Are you seeing an uptick of fathers in the community? The immediate answer would be no. And the reason why it would be no is because that was what was being drilled into us. And so when I was able to actually sit down with teachers, ask them to go through each one of their children on their roster list and say, do you see this father come and pick up their children? And they would say, before we did that practice, they would say, oh, hardly any, just rare, just never, like not very few. But then when we actually sat down, a lot of the times the numbers would go up, and it was almost like, it was like 50%, you know, what you would expect for men and women. Those numbers would go up, and some of the teachers, some of them would be like, oh wow, it would hit them. Like, I remember some of the teachers saying like, oh wow, well, you know, I guess I was wrong. Like, but then there would be other teachers who would then still be like, well, he comes to pick the child, but he's not really involved. He's not doing X, Y, Z. And it's because sometimes it's a process for all of us. And this wasn't just women. Some Black men felt, you know, we're dealing with internalized racism too. It's a process for all of us to kind of eschew, you know, some of these ingrained, very long-term, enduring racist narratives that has just completely, you know, enveloped us all.
You know what? It's so interesting because, you know, when I think about how strong that narrative is, because we know recent research has showed that Black dads are more involved than any other race when it comes to their children, but that narrative it looks like from the 80s and 90s time period is still, you know, strong. And then when I think about hip hop, if I listen to 80s and 90s hip hop, a lot of how those narratives were shaped kind of looked at dads as absentee and that sort of thing. However, you know what? One of the things that your book points out is a teacher that goes by Miss M, who happens to be like my shero in the book. Like, without giving too much of it away, she basically gets into a conflict with a young lady at the daycare, at the child care, and is basically over letting the father be a participant into the child's education, and how she wanted to basically gatekeep him in that, and how Miss M just, you know, says, look, unless you have an order of protection, I'm going to let this dad see the child. So, you know, could you expand a little more about some of the sheroes that, you know, were champions for fatherhood and that sort of thing? So
yeah, and that's so important. And I loved Miss M. Like, and she was such a champion for fathers well before I got there. So she was, you know, she was an older woman, I think in her late 60s, 70s. And for decades, you know, when people truly did believe that Black fathers had no place, you know, taking care of their children. She was like, no, absolutely. If they're interested, we need to encourage them to do it even more. And so though there's 2 chapters in the book where it seems really crazy that I focus on mothers in a book about fatherhood, but because of the nature of when you think about child rearing and child caring, especially in the Black community, when, you know, so much of the family life has been held by, you know, matriarchs. It was so important to understand the role that mothers have in kind of either encouraging Black men to step up and be fathers, or, you know, deterring it. And I wanted to make that clear. And Mrs. M was actually one of the teachers in her particular site. There was a lot of father involvement because of the way that even at that time, like now, I think more people definitely understand, you know, equality among the races. I mean, there's still some, you know, some issues, but people understand it better now. But 20, 30 years ago, she was up against a lot of, you know, like a lot of old understandings of what it means to be, you know, a mother and a father. And this idea that if you're not providing for the kids, if you're not my husband, if you're not a husband, then you're not a stand-up guy, and you should have no role in the child's life. And not only that, that the mother is a complete arbiter of whatever happens to the child, and the father has little to no say, especially if he doesn't check all of those boxes. And Mrs. M was like, oh, no, there are two parents. And in our neighborhoods, children need both parents. They need more than their parents. So unless there is a reason why this father, you can show that there's a reason that this father is hurting the child, going to harm the child, then you cannot, I'm not going to just listen to you and say he can't be here. And there were other, unfortunately, other workers there who didn't take that stance. Who, if the mother said, it was what the mother said.
Wow. You know what? One of the so just have a couple of more questions, and again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your work. I mean, it means a lot to me as a dad working with fatherless fathers or dads who have experienced dad absent and looking for that. The two questions that I have for this, so the first one is about the dads. What are more lessons that dads can learn? Let's say if a dad grew up father absent, what is it that they can learn from hip hop narratives that can help them to be a better dad?
I mean, the thing about the hip hop narratives is just there is so many different, perspectives. There's so many different ways of balancing out what it means to be a father. And so being able to hear that the lessons fathers can learn is that you can figure out your way. As long as you love this child, you want to support this child, you can figure out this way. And even if you don't check these particular boxes, you can still be a very good dad. And that there's community right now that like the thing I think that many fathers was challenged by a generation ago is that this wasn't a conversation. Black men wasn't necessarily talking about fatherhood in these terms, but Black men are definitely talking about it now. And so you can find community when you feel like you're being, discriminated against, whether it's racial or gender. There are places now that you can go. There are stories that you can see. There are situations and circumstances where you can see your fellow fathers being able to gain custody of their child, so all of these things, like the hip hop narratives, that was just a way really for people to kind of go global and to come local, right? So it's like, oh, these hip hop artists, they're involved with their kids. So it's not just me. Let me look around. Who else? Let me connect with so and so. Let us be good fathers together. Let us support each other. And so, hip hop narratives just kind of give that kind of golden stamp. Of course, there's always going to be, there's always going to be different narratives that don't match your own, but you can find what works for you and go with that.
Yeah, I mean, because one of the things that I found so intriguing about your book is some of the fathers were saying, just the perception, if you're a deadbeat dad, I don't even want to hang around you. And I think hip hop has a lot to do with, these dads seeing an absentee father as a social pariah. Like, you're not being celebrated for being absent in the kid's life,
Yeah, absolutely. Because for a lot of these men who want to be good fathers, many of them had fathers, who wasn't involved in their lives. And when you CL Smooth, he talked about how his father was a deadbeat, but he also talked about father figures, other men in his life who became his father. Tupac, did a whole song, talking about how terrible his dad was. And yet still these men took that information and, want to turn it around, don't want to continue that negative cycle. And a lot of the times these men, these fathers, these were younger men in single mother homes who was taking care of their siblings. So kind of knew, kind of understood that caretaking from younger and carried that on to becoming good fathers. But that process wasn't documented in academia because no one was looking that hard. But you have to be able to, if you're going to study the Black community, you have to study it from within inside the Black community. And unfortunately, prior to my book, there were a few like Black scholars and non-Black scholars studying it, but not enough to really kind of understand and investigate a lot of what, parceling out a lot of like the terrible stereotypes that both the media and the academic community has kind of put forth on the Black community, where Black fathers being so marginalized from it.
You know what? And that's why your work inspires me, and that's going to be inspiring to my work, because I plan on doing a book on this too, about this turning the dissertation into a book about these fatherhood narratives. The last question that I have for you is, where can the people find Father in the Margins? Where can they get it? And then also your new work as well.
Oh, okay. Well, sure. So it was published by Columbia University Press. So if you go to Columbia University Press and put in Father in the Margins, you can buy it direct from that. But you could also get it from any bookstore. It's on Amazon, but the prices vary, but you can check it out. It's an academic book, and I'm just so excited. You don't understand how good you made me feel when you started quoting things from my book. Like, I'm like, he actually read my book, because it's a long academic book, and it's so nice to kind of engage with you on that, because for me, my book was a little different from what was already out there in the sociological work, and I didn't really get as much engagement, particularly because I left academia. So as opposed to my new work, I definitely decided that staying as an academic wasn't the right path for me. I wanted to continue working, in the practitioner world. So, I'm just super excited to see when other academics are engaging in my work, and whenever they ask me to support, I'm happy to.
This, like I said, your work is super dope. It was so inspiring. It made me feel like is hope, out there. And, and I plan on using this not only in the academy, I plan on using it outside, because I teach English composition, and a lot of it is centered on fatherhood and how that shapes our emotional intelligence and career readiness. So your work is definitely inspirational. So like I said, I just want to say thank you for that. Thank you for putting the work. Thank you for inspiring people like myself to want to keep fighting this fight of Black fatherhood and that sort of thing. So are you doing like fatherhood consulting or that sort of thing, or
Well, I do consult, but it's been a while since I've done like fathering consulting. But I'm excited about your work. I mean, because the hip hop narratives was just a section of my book, and for you to like delve into it, and I don't know if you're a hip hop head, but if you are,
yeah.
like, I think that's fantastic. And it's since I wrote the book, it's been about 10 years. It was published in 2018, but the study itself took much longer. So there's a lot that's happened in hip hop since then. So the fact that you're diving right into it, I'd be so excited to read it, and congratulations. And I'm definitely encouraging you on that, as well as your work actually working with fathering groups, because I actually think that that's what set my book apart from what the books that were out there. And I think that it'll definitely set your book apart as well, like being in the mix and being in the field.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So you heard it here for us, DadCypher. Definitely purchase Aasha Abdill's book, Father in the Margins. If you're in the Brooklyn area, and you, I don't know if you like chopped cheese or not, but if they see it, get her a free chopped cheese if you're a dad out there, because she's doing some good stuff for us. So thank you again. And I'm gonna go ahead and stop recording.